Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Hey everybody, this is Rob Huffman for Sin Sci-fi in the 60s, France Books Paperback Writers. And we're going to do what's long overdue, which is a discussion about one particular book. And ironically, we don't know who wrote it, but the reason I want to talk about it is it's probably the most renowned of the 75 France books, the France 75, because it gets into all other areas of culture around the world, and we'll get into that. But I have a guest today, Paul Apel. He goes by W. Paul Apel as a writer, and he just published this book. And it's so long, I need to look at the cover. The title's so long. I watched football early. The Day I Died, The Lost Edward, Frank Leahy screenplay. And Paul, before we get into the book, welcome. Why don't you introduce yourself and talk about your book, and then we'll get into the France book.
Well, thank you for having me. I like a lot of people, I first got into Ed Wood because of the Tim Burton and Johnny Depp movie that came out in the mid-90s. I'm not 100% sure. I probably had never heard of him before, although there's a possibility I loved Seinfeld, and I may have looked into Plan 9 because of the Seinfeld episode.
Sure.
But that's lost to the mists of time. The main thing is I loved that movie, and it totally captured my imagination and became... I've always loved movies, but from that day forward, it became the movie. If anyone asked me what my favorite movie was, I always said Ed Wood. And that used to change every couple of years. But ever since 94, it's been Ed Wood. After loving that movie, I just looked into anything I could find on him. And because the movie had come out, there was a little bit of a cottage industry, even though the movie had basically was a flop. It was anticipated, it was a Disney movie. It had big stars in it. It was a very successful director at the time, coming off of Batman and Beetlejuice and Pee-wee's Big Adventure. And because of that, there was a big wave of tie-in products, like Rhino Home Video released a bunch of the actual Ed Wood movies that would have been hard for me to find if they hadn't done that. So you could go into, back then in the 90s, you could go into like a record store and they would have Orgy of the Dead for $9.99. And, a year prior, no one had ever even heard of that movie. I mean, outside of a very select few people.
Sure. Just to interrupt you for a moment, I came to it from watching a string of Bela Lugosi movies. And all the classics from the 30s and 40s, and then I picked up Plan 9 with Ed Wood. It was a few years after it had screened everywhere, and so I watched those back to back in one sitting, and so that was my experience. But you're right, that was everywhere. You could go into all of those Glenn and Glenda, Plan 9 from Outer Space, Bride of the Monster, and you're right, even things like Orgy of the Dead had were available on video cassette. Yeah.
Yep, all that stuff, plus the movie was semi-based on Nightmare of Ecstasy by Rudolph Gray. I got that as soon as I could. And then, of course, that book blew my mind because it went into so much more about Ed Wood than the movie. The movie touches on about like a 5-year period of his life, the most famous period of his life. But the book was so comprehensive, with listing all these novels he wrote and all these movies that I never even knew existed. And it was just insane how much stuff was in there. And then, at the risk of revealing too much personal information, one of the first things I saw in the book was that he shares the same birth month and day as me. And so after, this movie hitting me like a bombshell, and I'm like, oh, finally the best movie ever made, I've discovered it. And then reading the book, and then the first thing I see is my birthday in the book. I'm like, it was meant to be. And so
it's kismet.
So I've off and on been interested in Ed Wood ever since. And sometimes there'd be like a 10-year drought where nothing would happen, and then all of a sudden a lost movie would come out, and I'd be able to watch it, and there'd be a flare up in my interest again, and then it would die down again. But the most recent thing with my book is that I was able to research it and write it a lot because of the fact that the world shut down for the COVID-19 pandemic. And I mean, I majored in writing. I've worked as a professional writer, written for newspapers and written all kinds of stuff that hasn't been published. So I was no stranger to working on writing stuff, but the being able to network with people who were bigger Ed Wood experts than I was, or who had personal connections to the world of Ed Wood, or, you know, tracking down the screenplay itself, getting my hands on it, finding a publisher that was interested, all that kind of stuff. I had so much more time, you know, working from home, not being able to go to movies, not being able to go to restaurants, you know, all that kind
Not
of
having
stuff.
to commute, you know.
Yeah, no commute, didn't have to worry about any of that stuff.
Yeah.
It was just so much easier to see something through from beginning to end, and plus, you know, some luck along the way and all that kind of stuff. But so when I first heard about this screenplay about Frank Leahy, it was on an Ed Wood blog, and I couldn't believe I had never seen anyone. It was apparently sitting in an archive somewhere, Loyola Marymount University, and I never understood, if it's just sitting there, of all the things written about Ed Wood or all the documentaries made about Ed Wood, why had no one ever gone into it before? And so I started to think, well, if I ever want to make my mark in the world of Ed Wood academia, or whatever you want to call it, that would be a good way to do it, because if no one's out, we know it's out there, but no one's ever covered it. And so I'd just be the first person to look into it, you know? And at the time I thought maybe it'd be a magazine article or a blog post or something, but it just kept, you know, gathering steam, and became a whole book.
And it's kind of funny,
to,
this particular, you know, like you mentioned Nightmare of Ecstasy. There we were, I think all of us fans, you know, we learned about all these books, screenplays, some of which were produced, some weren't, as in this one. But a lot of the ones that were unproduced, either eventually, like you said, in the last 10 years or so, things have popped up, lost films, lost scripts, and have been published and whatnot. But there's some that still haven't been printed that circulate, you know, like Trial by Terror. I read that in about 2006 at a university where I wore white gloves. And I read it, and then it was one of the actual scripts that was someone had paid to duplicate, you know, 25 copies for the cast and crew and whatnot. And I, at the time, I was just like, wow, you know, did I just see the only cut? But it circulated Xerox copies and whatnot. But this particular script is like, it just stayed in this light. It never unearthed, it never circulated. And so, yeah, you know, until your book came out, you were probably, you know, and you were nice enough to share it with a couple of us. You were the only one to have read this script in you know, 50 years.
Yeah, probably. I mean, who knows? But yeah, so Greg Javer, who is also, you know, a friend of the show.
Yeah, he's on assignment today. He couldn't be with us. And I should say we all know each other from Ed Wood Wednesdays, which he co-writes, which is Joe Blevins, part of Joe Blevins' blog, Dead to Rights.
Which is where I heard about the screenplay.
Yeah, I think that's how you and I met. That's how I met Greg. Joe Blevins is kind of the glue that has brought all these people together. But I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that Greg actually, right around the same time as me, also requested, and that's another thing. You mentioned looking and going in the archives with your white gloves and everything. If the world had been normal, that's what I would have had to have done. I would have had to travel to Southern California, go there, sit there, and in some ways that would have been cool to see the actual. I mean, it's presumably an actual production screenplay for a production that never happened, but still with handwritten notes on it and stuff. It might be a photocopy. I can't tell because I didn't see it in person. But that would have been how it went. But
Yeah.
because the whole world was shut down and everything, they were the library was sending samples through the mail or sending scans through email. And
It's a very
you
fortunate exception, right?
Yeah, you had to pay them to do it. But
because I don't know if you went there and read it, as you know, as if you could, if they'd even let you make photocopies, you know, of an original document. So
that is a good question. It might have been one of those things where they're like, you can make like copy 25% of it or something like that. And in fact, that's what the rules said when about paying to have it mailed to you or emailed to you. They were like, yeah, we'll send you like half of it or something. But for whatever reason, the whole thing, first of all, I wanted them to mail it to me because for some reason that was cheaper than them scanning it. And secondly, I was only expecting half of it. Instead, they said, we'll scan it, no extra charge, and scan the whole thing. So I brought up Greg because around the exact same time, he was also requesting it from the library. So the two of us were separately requesting it. So,
sure. And I should mention, Greg writes a forward in the book.
Yes.
Your book, yeah.
Yes, there's a forward in there. Originally, our dream was to have the commentary be the two of us. The concept is kind of, and Joe actually said this on his blog, the concept is kind of like a commentary like you would have on a DVD or Blu-ray special features for like a movie when you listen to an audio commentary.
I agree.
It's like a commentary for a script that was never produced. So
That's right.
A written commentary. So
I think it was a clever way for you to speak of it, you know, rather than just like, here's the document and I'll write about it. Because we bring out all the Ed Wood tropes and tools and devices that you know, that and it's kind of funny because this particular story, while it's a script by Ed Wood, so he's going to approach it a certain way, it's a very offbeat topic for him. Frankly, he being a coach of Notre Dame, the Notre Dame football team, it's very random for a guy that wrote, you know, science fiction, horror, and, you know, pornography.
Yeah. And actually so on one hand, when you were saying no one had ever looked into this before, on one hand, I was thinking it might be because of the subject matter, because if the people interested in Ed Wood would also not be interested in football, you know what I mean? And so it sounds boring. From my point of view, I thought it would be an interesting angle that it's so unlikely. I mean, it goes both ways. Like on one hand, if you discovered a lost Ed Wood screenplay and it had everything, like it was Angora and aliens and Bela Lugosi and horror, and no one had ever heard of it, and it had every single Ed Wood thing in it, that would be great, you know. But the second best thing, or maybe a better thing, is something that makes absolutely that you would never associate with Ed Wood. Then you have a nice angle to talk about it, you know, instead of just being, you know, like, what'd you say, Trial by Terror?
That's right. That's the jungle adventure. Yeah.
So I read that, and that would be interesting, but it's the worst thing about it is that it's kind of boring. And so, and it's
there's a lot of like, you know, insert your jungle, you know, tiger, boa constrictor. There's a lot of that. It would have been compiled probably from old 30s, you know, serials or something, like pulling footage, not a lot of new. And he does that obviously in his films, but it's very heavy in that script.
Yeah. And it's kind of like if you watch Bride of the Monster, there's a couple scenes where they dwell on the fact that it's a swamp and that there's snakes, and then it shows you stock footage of a swamp, and you think like, well, that's what Trial by Terror was gonna be. But in any case, because it's such a like genre, I mean, I guess the Notre Dame screenplay is too. It's a biopic, but kind of in the style of a classic Hollywood like hero worship biopic. But you might be like a Trial by Terror book would probably be like, you have stuff at the beginning talking about it, and then just print the screenplay, and then the main attraction is just to be able to see the screenplay, I think, because you can't expound on stuff you expect from Ed. You can't expound on it as much, you know, or
Yeah.
at least I can. But the push and pull between Ed being this quirky character who has all of these, you know, things he writes about that come through in his writing, no matter what he's doing. Like his whole adult career is full of him basically wanting to do horror and sci-fi, but having to force it into adult books, you know, to a certain extent. And so it was kind of the same thing. I was wondering with this screenplay, would it really just be dry and boring, like, you know, adaptation, the bare minimum, no personality comes through? Or will it be like insane because it's the life story of this football coach through the eyes of Ed Wood? And it's a little bit of both in the end.
And
There's
it's
a
interesting
section,
to find those things that make him idiosyncratic in the screenplay. And for people that don't know a lot about the main character, he was the protege of Newt Rodney, who people know a lot from the Ronald Reagan movie and whatnot. But one of the things, you know, we mentioned, you'll find a Angora sweater thrown in here, but you know, a lot of people sometimes forget, you know, Wood was a huge fan of Westerns and all the horseback riding, and, you know, and that was very colorful in this script, and almost, you know, over the top. And but anyway, why don't we also have you explain what's to the people that don't know, that aren't Ed Wood fanatics. Tell us about the title. Why is the title what it is?
So it's I realize it's kind of an unwieldy title, and the more the book gets out there, the more I realize it, because people say, oh, what are you doing? And oh, a book just came out. Oh, what's it called? And then, oh, well, it's called I Watched Football Early the Day I Died. And then, wait, what is that again? What is it called? Why is it called that? So it's basically an inside joke for Ed Wood, a dark inside joke for Ed Wood fans. And I kind of thought it might end up getting changed. It was the first title I thought of, and I thought it was funny. But I thought, if this ever gets published, someone's going to say we can't title a book this. And it'll just be called The Frank Leahy Legend, or whatever. But no one said anything, and that's how it went to print. So anyway, the explanation is twofold. So there's two things. The first thing is that I found it interesting that Ed Wood had written a screenplay about a football coach, when the only references to football I'd ever seen in anything I'd ever read about Ed Wood or watched in a documentary was that he didn't like football. His widow is on record as having said that, and that there are conflicting reports of football being on the television when Ed Wood had his fatal heart attack and died. And some of the accounts make it sound like he was literally in a bedroom with a TV on, with football on the TV, and he had a heart attack and died. Other people say, well, everyone was over at the house watching a football game, and Ed didn't like it or wasn't feeling well, or both. And so he went in the back room and laid down and died. In any case, there was football on TV in the general vicinity of Ed Wood. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing is a screenplay he was very proud of at the time of his death, that he was hoping to get produced, and that he was one of the few things he brought with him when he was evicted from his apartment a couple days before he died, was a screenplay called I Woke Up Early. Well, depending on who you ask, either I woke up early the day I died, or I awoke early the day I died. And since Ed died like mid-morning and was watching football and had just written that screenplay, and it was one of the last things he had with him, I thought a good title is I Watched Football Early the Day I Died, which
it's a terrific title. And it's funny too, because it would have been very strange if it was a Notre Dame game playing that day, but I can't remember offhand. But
Ah,
I think it was NFL. But
yeah, we tracked it down, or Greg, I guess, someone tracked it down. Someone gave me, I think it was Greg, gave me a screenshot of the TV guide.
I've done the same thing.
Have you
And I
seen
can't
that?
remember offhand. I can't remember. I want to say the Dolphins were playing, but
Well,
I
it was
can't
a
remember offhand.
LA, it was definitely a Los Angeles team. I mean, I know it's two teams, but obviously I don't know much about football, but I do
Neither did
know
Ed
two
Wood. No.
teams um and I saw the clipping, and actually I should have put it in the book. Like, there's not very many images in the book, and
Yeah.
that would have been an interesting thing to put in there. But there is a TV listing, and even though you think to yourself, especially in the late 70s, there wouldn't be a football game on, especially a West Coast football game on at like 10:30 in the morning or 11 in the morning or whatever. But there sure was. And I even found footage on YouTube of what I believe is the game. However, no, wait, sorry, that's not true. I found footage on YouTube of other games that were broadcast that day, but I haven't been able to find the actual game Ed Wood was watching. And I even have a friend, he actually designed the cover, a friend of mine named Patrick Truby, who works for ESPN. And they have archives of all this stuff. And so I asked if they could track down footage of that specific game. And
Yeah.
I guess they weren't able to, because I never went anywhere. But
Yeah.
but anyway,
Could
I
have
guess
been.
you've seen one football game, you've seen them all, right?
And maybe that's the only one he saw partially.
Yeah. Well,
And
it's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, strangely, that script was eventually kind of with the energy of the Ed Wood Tim Burton film from '94. This script, not this script from your book, but I Woke Up Early the Day I Died, was produced, and
Yeah.
with the Ed Wood curse, despite all the big names in it, it never came out on. I think it might have screened once. Maybe it was on video in Germany. It just, I think all his fans have seen, bootlegs of it. I think it even has time code on the bottom and whatnot.
Yeah.
It's a fun film, particularly if you're an Ed Wood fan, but it's just funny that it flopped. I don't know if they ran out of money or legal problems, but it's just so funny that his last unproduced screenplay that we knew of at one time had a cast of characters in it. I won't get into it, but it's just funny that you can't get it. And it probably has, I don't know. It's just it's like a curse, like something had to go wrong.
I know. And it's crazy because, like you say, there was the popularity or the potential popularity of the Ed Wood movie. And then there was, in the 90s, independent movies were like a thing all of a sudden, after not having been a thing for a while, and, all the hot indie stars were in it. And even if it wasn't, huge like Clerks or El Mariachi or Pulp Fiction or something like that, it really stood a chance of becoming, like a cult film and having modest success. I mean, it's not like it cost a lot to produce or anything like that. But yeah, I don't understand the legal problems, but there's some kind of legal problem with it where it only got released in like one market. And if you live in Portland, Oregon, like me, you can go down to Movie Madness, possibly the world's greatest video store. I haven't been to them all, but it's a pretty great video store, and they have a great Ed Wood section, and you can get a bootleg. It's either a bootleg or an import. You can rent. I Woke Up Early the Day I Died and watch it.
That's funny. I bet it's like a DVD from Germany. I bet somebody must have had to.
It might even be a VHS tape.
Okay.
I can't remember if it was a DVD or VHS, but anyway.
Very cool. So, talking about Ed Wood, that's why we are interested in France Books. There was a true crime writer. We'll get into him on a future episode. And his daughter says, you got to watch out what he says, because a lot of it's baloney. And he also wrote a lot of tell-alls, starting in Hollywood as an actor. And he wanted to be a director, but it didn't really pan out for him. In 1997, he wrote that in this tell-all, there was a short section about that he met Ed Wood at France Books. And I kind of believe it because there's very specific things that he writes about. Although, and I can't, could you say, oh, there was enough energy, as great as a movie as Tim Burton's Ed Wood is from 1994, it did fine. I'm sure it made money, but it wasn't like Disney, like, gold mine. Would it pay off for him to make up this whole section about Ed Wood when he actually knew other people? He made some outlandish claims about some very much more famous people. Why go down to Ed Wood to when a lot of people don't even know who that is?
Like no one would care. So
so Greg and I started. I had found this short story that somebody claimed Ed Wood wrote that was in one of the France magazines. Greg and I found another that we felt very strongly was written by Ed Wood. We bet our pinkies on it, but there's no definitive proof. It was a anonymously written story, unattributed. But then Greg got you together and James Pontilillo, and we all started looking at some France books to see if we could find Ed Wood there. And so I think we each took one, and we didn't find too much success, but we went, the four of us went in on a fairly decent sized lot of books that we got at an auction. And Greg had arranged to get those scanned so we could all read them and whatnot. And Jim had done some textual analysis that was showing that they didn't look to be aligned with known works of Wood. So we kind of lost some steam there. But in doing so, we found all these other very interesting writers, like this true crime writer I mentioned, and all these science fiction writers, hence the title of the podcast. But this particular book we're going to talk about, Cleopatra's Blonde Sex Rival, we don't know who the writer was. So why are we writing? Why are we going to talk about this book if we don't know who wrote it? And it's because it's actually a very funny book. And it pops up everywhere in pop culture. And you got to draw this card. And so when you first approached it, you were, people take different ways of approaching. You were just going to read the book, but you were also analyzing the book, and people can do a psychological analysis. But it was like you're doing this Woodian analysis, like is this Wood? So before we get into the fun bits about it, could you just kind of give us a rough synopsis and introduction to the characters and this very funnily named book by Walt Vickery? And you can also mention how you tried to see if you could find him and whatnot.
Yeah, well, okay, so I'll start with Walt Vickery. So I tried to figure out, there's a possibility it's not even a pseudonym, some people did that. The only books by Walt Vickery I could find that were not this book on the internet were books written from 63 to 74 about Soviet literature. And they seemed really dry and academic and stuff. And I was thinking, this is probably not the same Walt Vickery. The only other Walter Vickery I could figure out was a rugby player, which is kind of like football. A famous rugby player named Walter Vickery, and the tagline, I wish I had the cover of the book in front of me. The tagline of the book involves the word sport. Do you remember what it was?
That's right. I don't have that in front of me. Unfortunately, this is a book where we only have, you and I only have scans of it. I'd have to pull it up. But you're right. There's sport in the title, or on the blurb.
I think I can pull it up. Ancient Rome, where orgies was a sport. So first of all, orgies was a sport. Orgies was okay. I was gonna get grammatical there, but maybe I'll let it slide. But because he's an athlete and the word sport is on the cover, I was like, oh, that's interesting.
It's kind of funny.
But I'm sure it's not that guy. So long story short, too late. We don't know who Walt Vickery is. the book, now I have to, full disclosure, I read it when was it, a year or two ago.
Yeah, a year and a half or something like,
Uh,
yeah.
So I took copious notes, so I will refer to those now as I give you a synopsis. But essentially, it is about a 18-year-old blonde virgin Nordic woman who's referred to as a barbarian from the point of views of the Romans. And the book begins with her being sold into slavery. And she has a chance meeting with Julius Caesar and kind of naively gets a crush on him and is fixated on Julius Caesar for the rest of the novel. Anyway, she's sold into slavery. She is sent to be trained to be one of the Vestal Virgins under, now I'm not going to be able to pronounce, they name her Cybele. Is that what you would?
That's how I've been pronouncing it in my head. I haven't said it out loud actually, but
or Sibylle, I don't know, Cybele. And the woman in charge of the Vestal Virgins is Statir, or I don't know.
Statira.
Yeah, Statira. She has an interesting origin story because she used to live in Egypt and she was banned from the country because she was known as a great lover, and Cleopatra can't have any competition. So she exiled Statira, who then went on to become the boss of the Vestal Virgins.
And our main character ends up there because I guess she was sold to Brutus Rex.
Yeah,
and he and his compatriots, none of them could because she was too much for them, to say the least. So they're just like,
yeah,
she must be a Vestal Virgin.
yes.
But that's how amazing a beauty she was that these men could not, these old senators could not perform, and
Yes.
so they had to give her some title to get rid of her and give her this guy. And it's funny, when that happened, I was just like, is she like this Nordic goddess? At first, but quickly that goes away. So anyway, yeah, you can pick it up in this den of supposed virgins.
Yeah, well, it gets, I mean, it's one of those things where it's just one damn thing after another. So I don't want to get too much into the convolutions of the plot, but she, having met Brutus, hatches a plan with him where he says he will introduce her to Julius Caesar, who she's obsessed with, if she will bring him intel. She will be his spy, basically. Caesar escapes whatever plot there is on him by going to Egypt and brings Cybele with him. And on their way across the water, she seduces the master of the rowing slaves. And a year and a half later, I think this was the most memorable sequence because the master of the rowing slaves has two giant like drums, basically, and he keeps time by banging the drums like this. And she goes down and seduces him, and there's a very descriptive sex scene in which it's all timed to the timing of the drums and the rowing of the boat and stuff. And that was, I think, like the most imaginative, interesting, memorable thing in the entire book. And you could skip over it, except in a twist of fate, the master of the rowing slaves comes back later, but we'll get to that in a minute. So now that she's in Egypt,
to interrupt for a moment, it's funny, these kind of books, the true crime writer will get to mention he would write them in 9 days, and sometimes there's like big ideas they quick, that it's just like they kind of funnel. So it's funny to have a big moment more in the middle of the book, because a lot of times it's just like, it's just filler, the last 50 pages of the required sex scenes every 10 to 20 pages, and trying to tie the plot together and finishing and getting it off to the publisher. But anyway, you're right. That's kind of unique that was such a moment in the middle of the book that someone took time. Maybe that was the, they felt nice and fresh on that fourth day approaching the novel.
Yeah. And it's such an audio visual thing, instead of just going by the numbers. It's almost like, when I'm reading it through the lens of, is this Ed Wood? On one hand, it's almost too interesting to, not to bag on Ed Wood, but on the other hand, it is like probably the most cinematic part of the book. And so you do think, oh, this person's thinking visually and audio, they're not just, hammering it out.
Yeah.
But in any case, she gets to Egypt with Julius Caesar, and of course runs afoul of Cleopatra there, because Cleopatra is also in love with Julius Caesar. So Cleopatra wants Cybele assassinated, but Cybele outsmarts her. But meanwhile, the Queen of the Vestal Virgins, who we met earlier, is so into Cybele that she travels to Egypt to get her back. And there she forms an alliance with Cleopatra, because an enemy of my enemy is my friend, or something. Or no, a friend of my enemy. I don't know. Anyway, they hatch a plot where they get her shipped back to Rome. So we're going back and forth: Rome, Egypt, Egypt, Rome. On her way back to Rome, wait a minute. Yeah, on their way back to Rome, the ship is attacked by pirates, and Cybele is, in a distasteful part of the book, the entire pirate gang rapes Cybele, but the pirate boss stops them and does not rape her. And it turns out that he is the rowing master of the boat that she seduced on her last oceanic voyage. And somehow their tryst had inspired him to leave the life of slavery and become his own master and become a pirate on the high seas. So the two of them recognize each other from that event, and they enter into a mutually beneficial affair, and they live out their days they don't live out their days, but they live some nice days on a pirate island, almost happily ever after. But what happens? Caesar shows up. Caesar and Cleopatra show up, and they steal her away from the pirates. So now we got the love triangle back together again, and they decide that they're going to figure out once and for all who is a better lover, Cybele or Cleopatra, by having Julius Caesar do a double-blinded test. Well, not double-blinded, blinded, I guess, test. One night he will sleep with one of them, the other night he will sleep with the other. He won't know which is which, and he will say which one he likes best. Cleopatra, being deceptive, figures out a way to trick him, and even though he likes Cybele better, he chooses Cleopatra. And they ship Cybele back to Rome again and say she'll be in the custody of Caesar's pal, Mark Antony. Now, some people might recognize the name Mark Antony when it comes to Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. And once there, Cybele at first resists Mark Antony, but then eventually gives in to him. And her last thought as the book closes is that having an affair with Mark Antony is the best revenge she can get on Caesar. And that is how the book ends. Possibly with kind of treating it as a prequel to the like Antony and Cleopatra by William Shakespeare, and all manner of Hollywood films.
It's a strange setting, and using real life characters for a sex novel. And you're right, it is a very epic cinematic thing, this idea of going, boats going back and forth and back and forth. But strangely, while I haven't read it, there's a France book called Sex and Nero's Rome by Victor Harris, and that Vic makes me wonder if it's the same as Walt Vickery. Keep getting tied up over Vickery. So it might not be the only historical novel in France, but it's a very strange, big ideas for, normally these kind of books at France Books have fewer characters, and they're not, none of them are come from history, and they usually, a lot of them are in Hollywood, although there's a few that are science fiction books. They tend to just have a much smaller scope, which like Ed Wood would have probably had a smaller scope, because I almost feel like he often wrote in a way, even though he often had carnivals, so that would be a big set. He just seemed to write in a way that was more like he could picture it as a film that he could create on a small budget. If anything was too big, it had to be found footage or purchased, royalty-free old movie footage. But so in that case, it makes me feel like this wouldn't be from for Ed Wood, although we found stories he's written, short stories he's written about some Nordic gods, Thor and Odin. But even those, there's just only like 4 characters, and it's really, it's always this, like bedroom farce.
Yeah.
But
which in some ways this gets into that area because of the love triangle and everyone chasing each other around. I'm obsessed with this person, but they're obsessed with that person, and so on. But yeah, it doesn't hit you over the head with being an Ed Wood story at all.
And I do want to get into some of the things that you thought could, some of the Woodian elements. And I should say, none of us have made a definitive thing. I think we kind of are more on the side, especially given some of the vocabulary, that it's not Ed Wood. But there were enough things to make you take pause. And I'd like to get into that. But first, I just wanted to talk about why this book is renowned, when nobody knows who wrote it, and it's kind of this silly random book. But one of the things that I came across early on was that it appeared in a British music tabloid, because there was I'll have to look at my notes for the specific name of the movie, but there was a premiere and there were pictures taken, and the premiere happened in America, but the pictures ended up in this music magazine. And Meatloaf was there with Blondie, and she's holding a book, and you can't really see it, but they managed to put it in the captions that it was Cleopatra's blonde sex rival, and she probably picked it up just because blonde, she probably thought it was funny. Who knows if she even read it, but she brought it to this premiere. I'll show a picture of the cover. It's a very dramatic, very interestingly painted cover, and we know the name of the artist, but I can't find anything else by him. So that's odd. I'm sure he did other covers, but so anyways,
interesting. If they had made a movie of Cleopatra's blonde love rival, and it starred Meatloaf and Debbie Harry, like, I'd go to that. That sounds great.
That would be awesome. Who the other people that were at this premiere included the guitars from Cheap Trick, and then the star of Little House in the Prairie. I was like, where'd she fit in? Melissa Gilbert.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, crazy.
So here we are in England in the early 1980s. You could pick up this thing and see, oh, here's this movie in America. Here's all these rock and roll characters, and someone just thought it was funny enough to include the name of the book that Blondie was holding. But this book also takes us to Ireland, and that's because it was banned in Ireland, but not at the time it was written in the early 60s, but a full decade later. And the Irish banned about beginning in the 30s, they banned 12,000 books, I believe. Wow. And a lot of them are ones that are like canonical works of fiction that everybody reads as school children here in America. So I mean, it's not just sex books, although there were plenty of things from like sex manuals to, but they hated pulp fiction, you know, anything. And there, I really tried to dig deep into this because I found it online that it was banned, and I went and I had bookmarked it and I couldn't find it again. And it drove me mad because I was just like, you know, here I'm we're working on this project and I had this cool factoid and I can't find it. So I went to the following places: the Government Publications and Election Services. I gotta know. The private secretary to the Minister of Justice. They were like, we don't know. The National Library of Ireland, and they're like, oh, okay. So this would have been in a newspaper, but it came out twice a week. So unless you know the year, there's, you know, 104 copies a year. They're like, you could come in. I'm like, I'm in America, I can't come in. So anyway, it was driving me crazy that this book had been banned by the government, but no one had any records, or it either predated computer systems, or they were printed copies in the library and you had to come and search. And so I kept digging. It was just this thing that nagged me. I spent way too much time on it. And I discovered this podcast called Censored. And it was by, and this kind of echoes something we were talking about earlier. She's a historian. The host, her name's I'm gonna botch her name, Aoife Bernacht. And she's a historian, and the library is closed and she couldn't go in. So she started this podcast where she decided she was going to cover these books that the government banned. And she helped me out and told me, yes, it was banned in 1973, which is kind of an odd time in Ireland. Like when they first started things, I think in the 20s, there was it started with this thing that was written called the Report of the Committee on Evil Literature.
Wow.
And then eventually it became a board of unknown people that would never let you appeal. And later on, I think in 1967, they'd kind of changed some laws, and if they decided to ban something, it would only be banned for like 12 years. And sometimes these books would be like in circulation. So Cleopatra's Blonde Sex Rival was in print for 10 years before it was banned. So it could have been all over, but it was like, okay, now that it's banned, you can't sell. I don't think they really cared if you owned it, but you couldn't, you know, if you were caught selling it, you could be in serious trouble. But yeah, Aoife told me that in August of 1973, this book was banned in Ireland, and the Irish Times is what would cover what books were banned by the government. So that's where you would find it in the libraries if you were in Ireland and looked for it. And nowadays, apparently, she found it, since it's like so difficult to find. They continue to ban movies a lot, apparently. And that is where she found it, in volume 6 of the Irish Film Classification Office, that this book was banned in 1973. So I finally got my answer, August of 73. Somebody must have picked it up. A little old lady and was like, oh, and made a phone call, and somebody, you know, caught it across the board. And Aoife and her podcast, which is a great podcast, it's wonderful. She would probably say that somebody maybe didn't even read it. You know, maybe they read a page or two and found something. And in her podcast, she always plays a game at the end called Censorship Bingo. And it's she has 25 categories, and the purpose of her podcast is to think like often a mid, yeah, I'm trying to say, you have to think like a censor and like a mid-century censor. And so she came up with all these categories, and they range from everything. It always like starts with breasts, which this book being a 1962 or 63 sex book, it's full of breast. That was like the selling point. But on her scale from 1 to 25, I got an 11, which is not, it kind of fell in the middle. I feel like things, you know, like a Salinger book would probably get a 7 or something, you know. So
yeah.
This was the era where they could just start kind of, you know, just there were laws, there were court cases that made the places like Epic Books and France Books be able to pop up and go a little bit further than they could in the 50s. And but they had to be very careful. There's no swearing. But there's things that, you know, in these kind of books that would upset a censor, like divorce. You know, the Irish Catholics don't want to read about divorce or abortion or those things. Are any if books had that, they got banned. But things that were on her list that you know, orgies, like it's on the cover, that probably did it. It's the fact that orgies was on the cover, it probably got banned. But just so the people that haven't read this kind of stuff, I just one of our other authors once wrote that the content of early adult books were just full of darting tongues and breast fetishism, and they weren't pornographic, mildly suggestive, perhaps is how he put it. And anyway, I just wanted to tell that whole story because it was just this funny thing I did on my own time during the pandemic, where I just had some spare time on my hand and I had this thing that just gnawed at me. But it ends up in other. Those are the two big things: is the English music magazine and being banned in Ireland. But it pops up everywhere. Like you can find a T-shirt with the cover available. It ends up in a lot of books about, and there's strange book titles too. But one is Rome Season 1, History Makes Television. It's name dropped in there. It pops up in The Judicial Corporate Punishment of Women, Stories and Novels, Ancient Egypt and Romance Erotica, and The Reception of Cleopatra and the Age of Mass Media. These are all books that this title appears in. And then the name Cleopatra in the title, obviously, is people are finding that. But anyway, those are some of the fun facts about this book. I probably missed a few of them. I often wonder if there was a buzz in Hollywood about the Elizabeth Taylor movie Cleopatra coming out. I think this was written in '62 and her movie came out the year later, but there must have been buzz about, you know, her and Burden. So I almost feel like somebody was like, you know, given the job, write a book about Cleopatra, and we're gonna have, this is the cover. They had the cover already, you know. Sometimes that's how these books were written. Although France Books, often their covers don't match the content whatsoever. It's just random what was available. But let's get back to Ed Wood and maybe some of the things in this book that popped out as something that he might, you know, tropes of his or whatnot. Being in Egypt, one of the things that you quickly pointed out was snakes.
I think that was the biggest thing in the book. And also, but it's not always something that comes up about Ed Wood. But if you watch and read enough stuff about him, you start to realize that he gets oddly preoccupied with snakes whenever they should happen to come up in something he's writing. He really zooms in on talking about them. And probably the most infamous example also involves Cleopatra, because I mentioned Orgy of the Dead earlier, but in Orgy of the Dead, there inexplicably there's a mummy character and there's a wolfman character, and the mummy is telling the wolfman about what life was like in ancient Egypt and talking about the snakes in Egypt and how he didn't like the snakes. And I can't remember now. I didn't take good enough notes, I guess, but the mummy also specifically references Cleopatra when he's talking about how much he hates snakes. And they're talking about snakes because I think it's a snake themed dance. And Orgy of the Dead is a series of stripteases, and each one has a theme. And somehow the dance is snake themed, although there's no oh, there's stock footage of a rattlesnake, but there's no the dance. It's not like From Dusk Till Dawn where she dances with a snake. But anyway, so I was thinking that's the closest we're gonna get. Is there's actually a movie that Ed Wood wrote in which they talk about Cleopatra and snakes. However, we talked about Bride of the Monster and Trial by Terror earlier, and both of those ones are good examples of how he's obsessed with snakes. Or not obsessed, but when snakes come up, it's a really big deal. I don't know, maybe in the military he had a bad experience with snakes. Maybe he just has a regular phobia of snakes like a lot of people do.
Could be. It's also very Freudian.
Well, yeah, that's
one
true.
could argue.
That's true.
You just made me think that there's a short story in which a very large snake appears, and it's like a cult.
Yeah, well, I don't know what that is exactly. However, I will say
this woman just wants to be part of this cult, and then it turns out that the leader is actually a giant snake.
well, there's an old Universal horror movie. I think it's called Cult of the Cobra or something like that. I can't remember the title of it. It is one of the you know how they have their A movies and their B movies. It's one of their B movies, but it is about a I think it suggests that the woman transforms into a snake and attacks people, but it's about these guys who run afoul of a cult, and the whole cult is centered around snakes. And Ed, being who he was, probably saw that movie. But yes, since you mentioned cults, there is a cult in this book. It's a snake cult, and in Orgy of the Dead, when the mummy is talking about snakes, he talks about them specifically being part of their religion, which religion cult. So, there's a little bit of a connection there.
Yeah.
Then there's snake charmers in the book. There's a snake cult in the book. There's snake dancers in the book. All that kind of stuff. So that was the biggest thing that jumped out at me, was the preoccupation with snakes.
It's funny that quote, I kind of paraphrased it by another writer. I keep trying not to mention the writer so I can pull them out of a hat when I do another episode. But he had mentioned darting tongues, and that's something that ends up in this book a lot. And it almost seems like that's something Wood used, but then this guy uses it, and I don't know if that was just a phrase used at the time, but it's also very serpentine.
Yeah, that's true.
But there's a lot of phrases and verbs that make me, they were like pulling from the same pot of what was allowed, what was legal to do at the time.
There are lots of Ed Wood words in the book, but it's, again, like you say, one of those things where you're like, well, all these guys would have been using the same vocabulary to talk about the same things, and so you can get a bunch of hits on all these words, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything, because we're all trying to do the same thing.
Now one thing that was very unique that you pointed out, and I'd come across it as well, is something that is very Woodian, and I'll read the quote, and you'll recall it. Someone states, and I forget the character because I have it out of context here. A character says, "I personally have never had to extend the horizons of my lust beyond that which a feminine garment encompasses." Yeah. And that is very ambiguous, even though I don't know if it was intended to be. And that's something I could see Ed Wood, who is a cross-dresser, we haven't made that abundantly clear, and the people that aren't familiar with him or haven't seen Tim Burton movie or whatnot, that is just a very strange thing to be in a 1962 adult book.
Yeah, and actually, the context of that is a character is essentially saying he's confronted with homosexuality, and the character is reflecting to themselves that he's never had homosexual leanings. he's never thought about it, but whatever, teach their own, go ahead, and it's a convoluted way of saying it. I personally have never had to extend the horizons of my lust beyond that which a feminine garment encompasses, saying women wear women's clothing, and I've only ever been attracted to women, but go ahead, you do you. But there's another quote where
and for a medieval setting, that's a very tolerant a statement,
which is kind of a through line of Wood's work, is
for sure.
kind of a live and let live attitude. Even if sometimes he verges into being the 40-year-old guy in the 60s, trying to deal with the sexual revolution and not totally understanding it and stuff, and paranoia about marijuana and stuff like that. But it's this weird combination of that, sometimes leaning into that, but in the end going, but oh well, do whatever you want to do.
It's very, very funny that as far as liberation, sexual liberation goes, he was open-minded, but then I forget what particular Apostoloff movie is but Wood wrote the script for, but it's like a college reunion. I think it's like 5 or 10 year reunion, and it would have been a class that would have been like, I guess, in college in the 1960s. And at the reunion at the hotel, they look across and there's a protest, and they're like, oh, those what, and they have complete animosity towards these protesters. And that's so Ed Wood, but it's just so funny that he's open-minded in some respects and very closed-minded, former Marine kind of mindset about other things. Don't cross, America, but be yourself otherwise.
And there's one other line in there that is kind of deals with gender, in which it's the narrator says, the allure of Cybele made youngsters of the aged and men of the indecisively sexed. And so all they're saying is that she's so hot that old men feel young again, and guys who are on the fence about sexuality suddenly turn straight because she's so hot. But the turn of phrase indecisively sexed was interesting.
And the one character you mentioned that was in charge of the Vestal Virgins, Statira, that's something that appears in these novels. I don't know if there was a lot of lesbian pulp fiction in the 50s, but in the 60s there's just it's more explicit, what's happening. The details go a little further, but it's not frequent that there will be a male homosexual, but there's lesbians galore in so many of these books. So it's just kind of funny. It's obviously there's a market that these books were aimed at.
And not only that, the character you mentioned fulfills, she does two things that show up a lot in Ed's work, and maybe other work at the time, I'm not sure. But the idea of a predatory lesbian woman who is taking advantage or wants to take advantage of a virginal, heterosexual woman. And that turns up, I might be a little bit off, but the basic thrust or the basic idea of that turns up in like Fugitive Girls, and the idea of lesbians being predatory, or maybe gay people in general being predatory, turns up every now and then, even though, he's also fairly cool about all that stuff.
Sure. He definitely, as far as that persuasion go, he definitely felt that there were, how to say this correctly, but the butch and Statira is kind of mentioned as having less curvaceous body. So and that's very Ed Wood to have the butch and then the femme characters. You're right. He definitely had this duality for that. Whereas he, where is he on the spectrum with his characters from Glenn or Glenda, or as appears in the movie or in the books, Killer and Drag. They definitely he's much more lenient with that persuasion. So it's just funny that you're right. And so that is a very Woodian thing. I agree with you that appears in this text.
And then the other side of it is being the book refers to her as being skilled in occult rituals. And it also, as we talked about earlier, her backstory is that she was the greatest lover in Egypt, and that's why Cleopatra kicked her out of the country.
That's right.
So she's a love goddess skilled in occult rituals, and that shows up too. Probably the biggest one is in Necromania, or the novel based on the movie, or the short story based, whatever. Madame Heels is an occult,
A necromancer,
like
even
a
though
witch or something. And it's specifically geared towards fixing people's love lives, or teaching people about sex, or if they don't learn the right way, damning them to an existence of just wanton lust for their entire lives. And then there's the Princess of Darkness and Orgy of the Dead, which is a little less, she seems like an occult type character, and she is obsessed with getting her chance at getting pleasure throughout the night, and
which always involves that dagger,
the dagger, and the heteronormative woman that they've captured. She wants to defile her, basically, and so yeah, that's kind of Woodian. But then these are also stock characters that show up in all kinds of stuff. I mean, the occult twist on it is a little unique to Ed Wood, but
I agree. I also wanted you to touch on being buried alive, which is kind of a Poe had such a fear, but that was a something that popped up in this book. And if you could talk about that in Ed Wood.
So Ed was always fascinated with graves, graveyards, death, things coming back to life, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of that stuff probably just comes from being a horror fan. But there may be psychological aspects to it as well, like having maybe a form of post-traumatic stress about some things he had been through, or who knows. But in any case, specifically, I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but it comes up throughout his work, the terror of being buried alive specifically, which is a terrible thought, but not something that everyone dwells on necessarily. Like, if you bring it up, you think, oh, that sounds terrible. But I don't lay awake at night thinking about being buried alive. Some people do, but
sure. I mean, in any case, it could become a weird. I was thinking of just Dracula. He obviously, entire life from a boy loved Bela Lugosi and Dracula, and that's somebody that lives in a coffin, is transported in a coffin. And so I'm sure that painted a lot of all his work, from early shorts he wrote for magazines to, like you mentioned, Necromania in the 70s, a film that he was completely involved in. Has plenty of Criswell's coffins, just like they appeared in Orgy of the Dead. And
what
was the one movie that Criswell is in? There's another Criswell coffin in there.
Oh, Night of the Ghouls.
Night of the Ghouls, yeah. So there's
but his coffin is also in Necromania, and actually they like, quote unquote, punish the main male character who's not learning the sex rituals correctly by forcing him into a coffin again. And he's, no, don't. And they force him into the coffin, but the occult love goddess is in the coffin, and he emerges from it having learned his sexual lessons. But yeah, I mean, as a form of being buried alive, he is forced into the coffin against his will. But in this book, being buried alive comes up in the context of they point out that the punishment for a Vestal virgin losing her virginity, therefore no longer being a Vestal virgin, is being buried alive. And so those are the stakes with Cybele when she's sold into slavery and becomes a Vestal virgin, and almost immediately has sex with a male slave.
That's right, a eunuch.
Yeah. Um,
And
uh,
you
uh,
kind of made a parallel, because I think there were a pair of these um eunuch slave guards,
mhm,
and yeah, she supposedly loses her virginity to him, and he's taken away in the middle of the act and killed. But
yeah,
that idea of these pair of guardians, like that also
yeah,
appears in Orgy of the Dead. And
yeah.
I
The
also
big
thought
strong
of,
guys.
there's some, I forget which, it's an unproduced script by Ed Wood that was supposed to have Lugosi in it, that's set in the West. It was also
Oh, the
supposed to
Ghoul
have,
Goes West.
yes, and there's two characters that just seem like twin Tor Johnsons, and I
Yeah,
just thought, I
yeah,
think of them again as these two behemoth,
yeah,
anyway, just
yeah,
another parallel there.
yeah. So we
So
got
in summation, it doesn't really seem, there are a lot of potentials for Wood having written this, but arguably there's just as many that he did not. Um, I think we're never safe until we know more. I lean
yeah,
that he wasn't involved in this, but it was really interesting to see what you pulled out of it. There was one other thing that I thought was really important. Um, Hollywood is mentioned in the
yeah,
text, and it comes out of nowhere. It's very, it like takes you out of the, you know out of the moment. um
yeah. And it stands out because it's the only, well, the only one I can think of throughout the book where the author mentions something not of the time period. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
you can write a book like as an author, like Charles Dickens or something, where you're always making asides to the like, oh, dear reader, listen to this, or that
yeah,
kind of stuff. And so it could have been written as the point of view of a modern author writing about the past, but the whole rest of the book is just kind of written like from the point of view of it is the past, and there we don't know anything about the future and stuff.
yeah.
And yeah, to your point, let's
And
see.
we know, Ed Wood was obsessed with Hollywood. I mean, and many people are obsessed with Hollywood. He just always wanted to make it, and he never let go of that dream. So by the time this book was written, he it would be like a decade dry spell where maybe he sold a couple scripts. But
Mhm.
other than that, he was just writing paperbacks until the later 60s when he started writing for magazines. But so that always pops up in all his work. So for something you're here, you are in Rome and Egypt, and someone's like, uh this woman is so beautiful, nothing will match this until the future. And basically points to Hollywood, and maybe the idea of Marilyn Monroe or Jane Mansfield or
Yeah,
something like that, this blonde goddess that everybody worships. It's an analogy, but it pops you out of the the time, and it's very
right.
startling.
Yeah, it was weird, and it did. Especially, it's very early in the book,
Yeah.
and so I hadn't formed an opinion yet. And I'm like 10 pages in, and the word Hollywood pops up, and I'm like, "Well, come on, this has got to be Ed Wood, right?"
Yeah.
But then maybe not so much.
But yeah, there were those things, and then as we mentioned, that ambiguous statement about feminine attire, those were things that really made you stop and go, because those are very those are just things that are tied in all of Ed Wood's work. And but overall, I feel like the book is like I mentioned, there's some vocabulary that for him to pull characters out of mythology or whatever, or history, that's not uncommon for him. He did that with like Western characters
Yeah,
and whatnot. um but although this back in 1960, there might have been editors that pulled out ellipses. He used a lot of those in his writing, and later on,
yeah,
I think those really are apparent when there was less proofreading or copy editing or whatnot,
hmm,
as because they were just, no one wanted to put the money into doing that because he was just, fired off.
hmm,
um those don't appear in this text. 'Cause I always try to keep that in mind. If Wood just started writing, there at a time there might have been this publishing house, there might have been someone that had a heavy pen and clean these things up. But other things that there's no italicized sentences. Sometimes Ed would like knock you out, like there'd be a paragraph and then a single sentence paragraph that was italicized to kind of knock it home.
Yeah.
And that doesn't appear, but I always wonder in typesetting, is it more expensive and did someone pull that out? There's no capitalized words that if Wood had written this, would Hollywood have been in capital letters, and maybe some other things like that. But it's an interesting yarn. It's not something you come across, and I don't know a lot of things beyond this particular publisher, except for other publishers around this time period that share the same authors, because that's where I've delved into. But I'm not seeing a lot of stuff that's like historical fiction. It tends to be like a smaller scope. So that's very. Go ahead.
It's kind of surprising too, because when we were talking about the potential appeal, like with why Blondie would have a copy of the book, or why this book would pop up so often in pop culture, it's kind of a wonder more people didn't take advantage of taking historical characters or whatever, because someone like Cleopatra is so iconic that it's almost like just taking a licensed character. It's like being able to write about, Superman or something without having to have the rights, because they're not only a real person, but from thousands, so long ago that there's not going to be a problem with it. And it's like almost a shorthand to selling your book. Like, people will know who you're talking about. People will recognize the cover, or it's a wonder more people didn't do stuff like that. I mean, I think that it's probably maybe, getting it banned in Ireland or whatever. It's probably more common in romance books that aren't considered adult, but are essentially just sex books, but aimed towards women.
And they're probably a lot more titillating than these books were in terms of content nowadays, especially compared to but I know what you're saying.
A lot of those are historical.
Exactly.
So I might have got a little off topic, but it's a wonder. That was kind of a shortcut to marketing, to choose a famous historical figure.
And to your point, everything we just talked about, it popping up here and there is because of the name Cleopatra. I mean, also that the title itself is probably the most screwball title of all the France books. So there's that going for it too. But I think you're right. I think that did have, people pick up on it right away. You recognize that, everyone recognizes that name as far as a selling point back in 1962, but it often pops up elsewhere because it's just people know that name. And it's funny because with the France 75, as we're calling them, even though there's only 74 books, one number is apparently non-existent. There's F1 through F70, and then E1 through E5, and F18 just doesn't seem to exist. But we still call it the France 75 because it's fun. I mean, who wants to drink a French 74? We try to make it fun. But there's not, these books don't kind of stand out. I mean, these kind of books are collectible, and some of the authors that I'm trying to make known are notable. But aside from this book, because of its title, it's only the books that have science fiction content in them that kind of stood out in my research, because science fiction fans, you can go to websites and it's like, here's everything this person ever wrote, and it includes everything that's just far out and kooky, so but other than that, this book kind of just stands out on its own, largely, I think, because I think the cover is striking, whereas a lot of France books covers aren't. And then the title's bananas, and we have a character that a real life character that everybody recognizes. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, just one last thing. So since I was reading it from the point of view of, is this Ed Wood or is this not Ed Wood? And since one of the most famous things about Ed Wood is that he was sometimes inept at the things he was trying to accomplish, being known as the worst director of all time and all that kind of stuff. I was looking for typical Woodian gaffes or things that he overlooked or whatever. And any book like this is going to have some of that, because like you say, they're dashed out within a few days. The people writing them don't necessarily care about them beyond getting a paycheck, and they think no one's going to see them anyway, and so on and so forth. There was one big one that I thought was interesting, because I always whenever I'm looking at something like this and I come across something that I think is interesting, I always think to myself, I'll bet you anything that they're never going to follow up on this, because it's piqued my interest, which means there's no way the book can go in this direction, because if the book went in this direction, it would be a good book, and in this case, there's a section where Sibel hatches a plot to avoid assassination by Cleopatra by faking her own death. And her idea is that it will get reported back to Cleopatra that she's dead. Then she can make a grand entrance being still alive, and not only give her a huge one-up on Cleopatra, but also her idea is it'll bewilder the quote-unquote superstitious Egyptians into thinking she is some kind of powerful goddess or something, like she rose from the dead, which is kind of Woodian. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. That'll be fun. It'll be, a nice one-up on, because they're setting up this rivalry between Cleopatra and her, and you want to see them hitting back at each other, and you want to see Cleopatra get in your face, Cleopatra, I'm alive. And so does all this stuff setting up this plot, and she even fakes her own death and everything. Then by the time that she ends up being alive, and Cleopatra seeing that she's alive, it's treated as if she was never dead in the first place. Like Cleopatra doesn't even bat an eye. No one mentions it.
It falls flat.
The author, I mean, Cleopatra is still annoyed that she has a blonde sex rival, but she doesn't go, oh my God, you're alive. And the people of Egypt don't think she's a god. But not only that, the way it's written, it's not as if it's written where Sibel is like, oh, that's too bad. I thought I was really going to get one up on Cleopatra.
Yeah.
It's written as if the author forgot they even set that up, which is totally possible. Like if you write something in one draft, of course you're going to be throwing out plot threads just in case. And then if they don't pay off, well, who cares? No one's ever going to notice,
Yeah.
So this one, when she was plotting, taking agency, rather than just being kidnapped or sold or shipped around the world by other people, our main character comes up with a plan and starts to carry it out, or successfully carries it out, and then the author forgets about it.
Yeah, it was a big buildup. You're right. It had this swell, and then it went nowhere. That stood out to me as well. That was very strange, and I think you're right. I think somebody woke up the next morning and kind of, I don't know, or just decided not to go there. Did their imagination not stretch that far? What would happen next?
It reminds me just quickly of there's a Batman serial a couple of Batman serials, but there's one where I think I can give this away since it's been 60 years or 70 years or something, where there's all these red herrings they're wondering who the bad guy is, and there's all these suspects. And this one suspect, every single episode of the serial, they say, well, is it Professor Hamilton? And they go, well, it can't be him. He's in a wheelchair. The bad guy's not in a wheelchair. And then at the end of the serial, when they're close to catching the bad guy, they walk in on Professor Hamilton walking around not in his wheelchair. And the Batman, the greatest detective in the world, and Robin and all of the cops and everything, no one says, hey, you can't walk. What are you doing out of your wheelchair? Even though they just spent the entire serial saying it can't be him. He's in a wheelchair. And so it's like no one on set noticed it, or something got cut out, or who knows. But
Right.
anyway, it's so interesting when this stuff gets set up and then whoever's setting it up just doesn't care about it.
Yeah, it just what was the point of of conjuring up all this energy and then it just falls flat. Yep,
Which
that was
seemed like something, the kind of thing that Ed Wood would do, which is why I bring it up. But
yep, I agree with you. It's another there. I can't think of anything offhand, but you're right. That is something that would definitely happen. Things ending sometimes too abruptly in his work and whatnot. One thing I thought was funny when I was poking around the internet for this, this is just kind of a goofy thing, is that with the idea of Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor coming out in 1963, I feel like that might have been why someone pushed this, and everyone has this image of her, this brunette, and so hence here we have this blonde rival in this book that came from the north. Using the keywords from this title to look for things, I kept coming across people claiming that Cleopatra was actually blonde.
oh, yeah.
And it was because she wasn't Egyptian but Macedonian Greek, and had blonde hair like Alexander the Great. But there's other people that say she was dark skinned. Like, so the arguments go in every direction, and they're as convoluted as who wrote this book. We will never know. It's lost to history.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you for being on the show, and I want to encourage everybody to go get a copy of your book, which is really, really fun. I should mention again, I watched football early the day I died. I think it's fun, regardless if you're a Wood fan or a Notre Dame football fan. It's just it's a lost artifact, lost script. It's fun to read scripts. I think sometimes scripts can even be thought of as literature, and no one ever thinks of them that way. Some are very sparse, some are very detailed. But anyway, it's just a fun analysis of a script that never got produced. We know there's lots of scripts out there in the world. Right now, we're in the midst of a writer's strike. So we have the battle of the writers against Hollywood. Some things probably never change.
Yeah.
But thanks again. And if we ever do find Wood in a novel, you'll be one of the first people to know.
Oh, good. Well, thanks for having me, and for all the kind words about my book. I appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.